Hello, welcome to the podcast on consciousness with Bernard Bars. Open-minded conversations on some new ideas about the scientific study of consciousness and the brain. We are here today with Bernie Bars, acclaimed author in psychobiology, including his newest book titled On Consciousness, Science and Subjectivity, Updated Works on Global Workspace Theory. Bernie is the originator of Global Workspace Theory, GWT, and Global Workspace Dynamics, a theory of human cognitive architecture, the cortex, and consciousness, and one of the founders of the modern science of consciousness.
Welcome back to On Consciousness, and we are joined by Mark Mitton, a fabulous magician, Giedd, a fabulous brain scientist, and David Edelman, a fabulous everything else, including musician, violinist, anthropologist. Take it away.
Leftovers. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is just sparking beautifully, and let's bring it back. What would you like to say? What's on the top of your consciousness right now?
Well, I guess, among other things, one of the things I've thought about a lot is what level of resolution is relevant in biology? What biological level of resolution is relevant to the study of consciousness or conscious processing? Where does the magic, please excuse the expression, where does the magic happen? Is it relevant to talk about consciousness simply as the nattering of neurons, the communication? Boy, I just invoked a spiroagnoism. I apologize for that. But is it there? Or is it something else? I mean, certain theories have suggested that it's somehow quantum-based, that somehow it's not even at the level of chattering neurons, that it's somewhere down in the microtubules, in the cytoskeleton, the skeletal elements of the cell, and has to do with some kind of quantal computation. So where does it lie? I mean, where does the important level of resolution, where should we concentrate our efforts if we're trying to pin down the phenomenon and the biological mechanisms underlying consciousness?
Can I say me?
Absolutely. Well, hey, sure.
This is not, I'm not supposed to be doing this, but what do we really know empirically? But where is consciousness found empirically? Is there consciousness in quantum mechanics? Is there consciousness in some magical mathematical expression? Or is there consciousness pretty much in a bloody everyday fashion in the biosphere, starting, let's say, how many feet underground, I don't know. And then in the air breathing and the water breathing biota that we know, the biological organisms. And then if we go to the top of the atmosphere, we have drifting bacteria and all kinds of stuff. But once we get to really cold space and really lots of radioactivity that's going to kill bacteria and so on, and the absence of air, all that kind of stuff. Do we find consciousness? And my kind of very conservative claim would be that the answer is no. We don't know of anything. Now, there may be, conscious plasma organisms in the sun. There are all kinds of possibilities. They're very intriguing possibilities, and maybe at some point, we'll just bump into them. But so far, as far as I know, we have not. And it's possible that, that there are physics projects that have already found ways to do this, but it's at least not well-established science. And if we take that very conservative, very narrow viewpoint, then we have an envelope around the planet that appears to be quite thin and that has thriving life. And in fact, it keeps on expanding, of course, because we get so-called extremophiles. in places where they were never supposed to live, but they are there, and it's an ecosystem. So I don't want to rule out any ecosystem, but outer space is not a friendly ecosystem for the biology that we know. So my suggestion for confining within reasonable bounds what we really know would be that, well, let's look at the biosphere, and then we'll learn more as we look. You want to look where the light is. So anyway, that's part of me for
my it concerns are, I think, connected in some way as a developmental neuroscientist of when does consciousness come on board in terms of what are the minimum necessary and sufficient components for that, I guess. The way I would see it, like a neuron isn't conscious, but a group of neurons are, and that's where the magic would lie, in terms of somewhere between a neuron not being conscious but a collection of neurons being conscious is one of the great mysteries of all of science for me. But I think that we have now increasingly better technologies and more people, I think, focused on this problem, that I think we can make progress into finding some of that magic between a neuron and a collection of them.
I think about how everything comes together, and terms that came up when we were talking were terms like context and connectedness and interconnectedness, and that's something I always think about, how easy it is to frame the problem in terms of ideas, but then also as a magician that takes action really seriously, then I think about that, and I think about interaction, and the social issues, like the group of neurons versus the neurons. But then I also think about how, we combine these different kinds of information sometimes with, just very lightly, like we combine cognitive information with physical interactions and physical gestalts and different kinds of environmental information. And when actually those things are so different, and then also in certain things, like once you're physical, you are social. Right. So those are the kind of things that I think about. And then also as a magician, I guess I think about how to fake consciousness. So like we were talking earlier about the ELIZA experiments, about like how, what was the professor's name at MIT who created the simple test, where he took information and fed it back. It's just the right
computer scientist in the 60s, but I can't blinking on his name now.
Right, and forgive me for not thinking.
But I should say not a psychologist, a computer
scientist, and it was an information. And we were talking earlier about how what's interesting about that to a magician is that magicians have used a similar technique, which is basically collecting information and feeding it back in just the right way to an audience, and then the feeling is a magical feeling.
So you're adding to a bunch of neurons. You're adding an enormous amount of interactivity with the physical world, with the social world, with the interpersonal world, with the emotional world, and magicians utilizing these interactive streams of information to create both conscious and to deny conscious information that's actually going on in your body, right? That's going on in your hands and your...
Well, the conversations, I mean, here we are in Gerald Edelman's library. And so, thanks to, I went to college with, David's older brother, Eric, and he introduced me to Dr. Edelman. And so our conversations almost from the get-go were comparing this very strange thing. Yeah. I actually asked him to not talk about his theory of neuronal group selection and rather talk about the actual physical interaction between antigen and antibody. The reason is because then we could compare the interaction between antigen and antibody to a magician doing a technique that was adaptable in front of an audience, so that you have this kind of feed-forward feedback effect. And one of the things that we always talked about is that if you're studying, I said, is this an acceptable way of saying what you're trying to express? Which is, if I'm thinking of any organic process in terms of a feed-forward effect or a feedback effect, that basically I'm studying the process from the perspective of one of the parts of the system.
Meaning The audience and the magician?
The audience or the magician. And actually, so if you like, so for instance, before I mentioned that in when I hear a cognitive scientist talking, they often to me have an expectation, which and that means that they're already thinking about the process in terms of one direction, right? So an expectation is a feed forward effect, right? But it's not a feed forward feedback effect. So as my understanding from Dr. Edelman was that it was really, really key that once to know when you were even had the possibility of talking about nature. And one of the aspects of any organic process was something that had to have feed forward and feedback at the same time. If it didn't have a place for both, then it wasn't, it could be an interesting point about nature, but it certainly wasn't describing nature. I mean, it's almost proof that it's a cognitive idea describing nature versus nature itself, which has that messier nature, that messier state of specificity. If that makes sense.
I think it makes sense. And one of the things we should clarify is, again, what antigens are and what antibodies are, and it's invasion and defense, right?
Yeah, but even that's really interesting, right? Because from whose perspective are you saying that? Because from the antigen's perspective, right? He's just an organism trying to be alive as well. So once you take the full account of that offensive, defensive, who's the aggressor and who's the protector?
It's a perspectival thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what's one thing that's useful about magic is to be able to do those flips. To instantly, when you hear someone talking from one perspective,
right?
Like, because even like if you hear a person, like I debated in high school, and one of the techniques that we would use is, of course, you had to learn to argue every side of an argument.
Right.
Therefore, when you receive the arguments, you could be more empathetic with the person attacking you, and hopefully come up with a better defense faster.
Right.
So I think this is also true of nature. If you're only focused on the direction, see, the directionality says that you're in the world of a consciously defined mind. It says you're trapped in your mind. Almost by definition, once you're in this more messy, alive world, like you just talked to me, and if I didn't talk back to you, you would know that I wasn't really with you.
So let me ask you a question. Suppose you're a Freudian.
Yeah.
And I'm constantly trying to read your unconscious, right?
Yeah.
And I have, let's say I'm a good analyst, whatever. And so I have ideas, not about your consciousness, but really about what's driving your consciousness, what motivations, what troubles you had with mom, whatever, all those kinds of things. And now I have a very clear idea of your mind, but I have no idea whatsoever about your consciousness. Is that possible?
Yes, but you're reminding me of the story of Procrustes, which would rip a complete hole in it.
Yeah.
Right? Because the story of Procrustes is the story of, a man simply on his way to a religious ceremony, and he's invited in to rest. It's a 2-day trip, famously outside of Athens. And he's invited in to Procrustes, and Procrustes invites him to lie down. And then he goes to sleep. And then the man comes in. Procrustes comes in with his magical tool set, which is a magical device to stretch the person out. Because what he does is he makes the person fit the bed, right? Because Procrustes is a magician and a blacksmith, and he uses his magical blacksmith tools to either stretch the person out or chop the person in half to fit the bed exactly.
Right.
That's the first version of the story. But and that doesn't fit Edelman very well, but it does fit Freud very well, because you put a man in a couch and you define them. But there's another version of the story, which is actually Procrustes doesn't have one chamber with one bed. He has 2 chambers with 2 beds. And he puts the person, let's say they happen to match one of the beds perfectly, and he puts them in the other bed. Because actually what Procrustes wants to do is kill that person with his magical tool set by either stretching them out or cutting them off. His real intention is to kill, the person. And so if you're not aware of that in the Freudian context, and you're busy telling yourself a story, then you can believe that story because you're trapped in this world with one room. But the moment you have 2 rooms, right? Now you have the ability to adapt. Now you have a magical thing known as repertoire. once you have repertoire, you can adapt to that person that comes in. And even if he matches your bed exactly, you put him in the other bed. You don't care. And you get to do what you really want to do, which is to kill that person. And if you don't know about that other bed, then you don't know the intentions of that person. And this might be the trap of the Freudian analyst, which is he might be trapped with his own stories that he's telling himself. It also might be the trap of the modern consciousness researcher who's trapped in a conscious room by themselves in one room, not knowing about the other rooms that they don't have access to.
Well, I think you've just described the process of science. And David and I had a conversation earlier about what you can call the bloody nose effect of doing actual science as opposed to anticipated science. We all go in with great ideas. We're really going to prove this, or at least we're going to frame things a certain way. And then you walk into the laboratory and there's a brick wall and you get a bloody nose. And this process happens more than once. It happens over and over and over again. It's happening to me right now, I'm sure, because you're posing interesting questions that I do not have a strict answer to, at least not yet. But it gives me something to think about. And what you end up doing, I think, in real science, is questioning your assumption and more and more and more. And you have to kind of back into an understanding of what you thought was a confined problem over here, but which in fact is a huge stack of contexts over here. And I noticed that you guys who are familiar with that process, horrible, bloody process, that you're kind of nodding. So this is kind of the, if you will, the counter move to nasty old Procrustes. Isn't that a sort of a useful counter move?
Wait, in what sense?
In the sense that you keep on, well, my metaphor is different. My metaphor is getting a bloody nose on the brick walls, and every single new experiment, maybe some of the old experiments, matter of fact, are brick walls where you get bloody noses, and you just kind of learn to wiggle around them.
But if what you said is true, then the Dvorak keyboard would be used by everyone. Just because you have something that's better, doesn't, the keyboard that we're using now, the QWERTY keyboard, even though the computer's advanced dramatically, we're using a keyboard that was designed consciously to slow us down to match the old manual typewriters.
So the keys wouldn't lock when they...
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
And the more superior keyboard, it was simply not adopted because it's a magical time frame passed and we had moved on and we'd forgotten about the Dvorak keyboard. So what you said, of course, is the intention of science and the hope for science, but it's certainly not the way that science is always done.
Well, I think it is the untold story of science, and I'd be curious because I see two people smiling at this. I'd be curious.
We were talking about Donald Knuth a bit earlier, a famous computer scientist who had this great quote: "I have just mathematically proven that this is true beyond so," and then comma, "so make sure you try it out," because you again and again our
right. Right. Well, that's
even part of consciousness, I guess, right? It's kind of ideas, it's counterfactuals. We have ideas, we think this is the way things should be, and then our perceptions modify and guide those predictions. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also part of the fun of science, right? In terms of doing that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly as well, like in terms of this kind of feed forward and feedback for your profession and work. Do you ever understand a neuroscience principle or a consciousness principle and then say, oh, I'm going to devise a magic trick, based on this insight? Or is it more the other way, like, oh, this works as a magician. I wonder what the neuroscience behind why this works is. I could see it kind of going both ways, but I don't know if No,
it definitely goes both ways. In fact, one of the reasons why I enjoy the conversations with the neuroscientists is because of the thinking about what the actual limitation is, right? So it's because sometimes, like in any field, there's kind of assumptions. In fact, It's one of the things that I'm most, I'm amazed by the the human ability to hold on to a story once it has a story, to cling to it in ways that I just find amazing.
Yeah.
And if anything, even taking advantage of that has been really fun. So it actually might be surprising in terms of some of the discoveries, like in terms of like the way people hold on to conceived notions.
Right.
And then also, but then within that you find, so for instance, when I make things appear, so I should just demonstrate. So if you say, there's a bunch of cards here, and just, if you could just say a card. Doesn't matter.
I'm sorry. I have a confession. I've never gotten into card games.
But that's all right.
Whatsoever.
But okay, this is not the first time, right, that this has happened. So what I want you to do is you should know that there's cards that are aces that are very popular and said a lot. There's also cards that are face cards,
Yeah.
and there's also numbers. So I would suggest, because aces are so popular and we want to make it surprising, that go with a face card.
Definitely don't want to go with aces.
Yeah. So go with a face card or a number. So you can have a jack, king, or queen, or any number between 2 and 10.
Right.
So which of those appeals to you?
I cannot even visualize
That's right.
playing cards. Will somebody help
Three
me
of
with
clubs.
this?
The 3 of clubs it is. Okay. So what I want you to do, he wants the 3 of clubs, and hold your hand out like this, right? And then I'm going to help you visualize the 3 of clubs just like that, right?
Whoa.
So it just appears. so
Wow.
And what would
how
you
does
just?
it though?
Well, what would
That
you have
was
said?
my fault. I should have said a different
That's
card.
right. What
obviously.
should you have said?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, say it.
I should have said 7 of diamonds.
Which is
but-
perfect. So what I want you to do is, we'll take this card, and what I'll do is I'll show the cameras like so, and I'll place it in your pocket like this,
Yeah.
and I want you to wave your hand over the top of the card and say unconsciousness,
Unconsciousness.
and slowly turn over the card in your pocket, and we can only hope that it's changed
in my
dramatically.
pocket. So you want to be able to see it in my pocket?
Yeah, and show
And I will.
everyone.
No way.
Hey, voila. So
This has got to be the luckiest night of your life.
it's the luckiest. It's never happened before.
Not
but
the history of humanity.
But one of the things that I did learn was that in a sequence, it's hard to describe, but in that certain things weren't needed, that you could cut to the chase and actually work a little faster. So that was really useful to me. In other words, once you accept that a physical narrative can also be a strong narrative just in terms of the story, and you actually don't need all the extra, it actually allowed me to do a different kind of editing. And that kind of thinking actually came out of these long talks. So basically, I would come to the Neuroscience Institute every 3 months over like an 8-year period. And in those conversations, that's one of the things, and we'd have a lunch, I'd have lunch with David, and we'd have with all these guys that thought about epistemology in action. And that made me think about that. And it did modify my tricks, because I was thinking like, oh, minds don't need that complex verbal story. You know, what they need is something dramatic to happen, and they know it when they see it.
So it's drama that captures people.
Well, obviously, when you talk about this in a survival environment, that's like novelty. And I did think a lot about firing people's amygdalas, which is kind of a strange way for a magician to think.
That's fear.
No, actually, and it was actually Eric who taught me that that's not the way that Dr. Edelman thought about it. He thought about in the older definition. So if you're talking to, and I've had long talks with Joe Ledoux about this at NYU, and of course that's one way of thinking about it. But another way is to think about the amygdala connected to the 5 Fs: fight, flight, feed, freeze, and fornicate. Then what you get, if you think about those and take it outside of a directional context, so if even in fight or flight, you're thinking about direction, feed forward or feedback by itself, but you're not thinking about interaction of an organism in an environment. When you think about fight, flight, feed, freeze, and fornicate, you have a repertoire to interact with novelty that you discover in your environment that could help you. So, and that whole way of thinking about the amygdala and short-term decision, this probably came out of my discussions with Stuart Firestein, about the amygdala and olfaction. But what I came up with was this whole idea of it's a tactical repertoire. And actually when you meet a woman that you love or a man that you love when you're a young person, and then that might take years for you to fulfill, but there's a part of some of this is actually very long-term thinking that's very directly tied to your amygdala. So I can't prove it, I'm not a biologist, but to me the way that Eric and then Dr. Edelman explained amygdala to me was actually very different and got outside of this fear-based context.
Yeah. So is amygdala paleocortex?
I mean, it has ancient analogs, and
I wouldn't say, I don't think.
But
the reason
hippocampus is here, amygdala is there, and hippocampus is paleocortex, right?
Yeah.
And so this little doohickey in front of the hippocampus, each side. So we're not sure. Right.
I mean, the reason I have a bit, so the amygdala has at least 13 different nuclei within it, each having different afferents, and so it sort of does a lot of.
But the wiring is not.
But and I see it more as sort of like that. It's like this is important for me to survive and reproduce. It's sort of fear, but I mean, it's like salient terms. Right. Yeah, it's like is this something that I should pay attention to because and those are the biological imperatives, right, to survive and to reproduce.
But in these discussions, there's actually, I remember now, it was at a dinner with Stuart Firestein and Avery Gilbert when I was talking about this kind of explosive quality that you just experienced, like when you do the magic tricks, because basically you're setting something off, right? And that's not so well defined. And looking at these neurocorrelates, because one thing that's so interesting, just like we were discussing before about big data, this wow can be set off by a discovery. But the interesting thing is then, of course, to a magician, we can use that discovery to cover something else up, because we can also, the first phase is understanding the wow, right?
Yeah.
But then we can also use that wow to eliminate all kinds of things.
But it's a very like powerful experience, right? You challenge my reality. I thought, like my brain is flooded with activity trying to understand what just happened.
Right.
Because it violated all my expectations. Like, how did he do that? And I think that's, it's very enjoyable, actually, that kind of sensation of being completely befuddled and kind of puts you on high alert. Like, I don't really want to understand.
But it's kind of an open question. Can you see why with that 5F meaning of the amygdala in terms of all that tactical response, then you start to get into this really interesting thing of not just reproduction salience, because certainly, the feed mechanism, is definitely about just survival in general, not reproduction, right? And freeze could actually help you in a fight situation. If you can, I was just with a primitive, a tribe, Amazonian tribal chief that was in town in New York for the, Indigenous Peoples Conference at the UN. And he was talking about that his tribe, it's not the Runa people, but it's next to the Runa people in the Ecuadorian rainforest, that they teach each other to rub, in old battle technique, they would rub themselves with wood and bite the stick, and that's how they would become invisible. But then we found out that they were actually making a kind of primitive camouflage, and the stick was allowing them to breathe silently. So at first it seems kind of silly.
Yeah. Huh.
So that's one thing I'd love to explore more with anthropologists but you see, it's like you can think reproduction or you can think just fear, but actually you can also, and again, I'm not a biologist. I can't talk about the neurocorrelates of magic, but all I can say is guys like Avery Gilbert said, you should check out the amygdala. And when I had long talks with Joe Ledoux about it, he seemed to think that there was something there. But we've not done research on this.
Yeah. But I think you could certainly quantify with fMRI sort of, was that a good trick or bad trick? My brain would respond very differently to if I was impressed versus not. If you could actually sort of gauge your effectiveness as a magician with
and as a magician,
brain.
We also have a technology called foveated coupling, right? So the foveated part of our focusing, is aligning and coupling. So in real time, I'm getting information whether I'm getting a wow.
So
and even if the person
eye contact, basically.
Yeah, but in the same way, if a person gives you a vulgar gesture, if they're not looking you in the eye, you can't tell whether or not it's sincere. It's basically
so
it's a
modifies it. The eye contact modulates the gesture or vice versa.
It contextualizes, and it's a part of the interdependent frame that we're in. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And it takes, instead of like words, which take so long, it can happen in hundreds of milliseconds.
Mm-hmm.
Can AI things do it in terms of are they technology advanced enough for me?
That's a whole. I mean, that's really interesting. Can a robot do? Because it gets into robotics and the AI, and I don't know if those experiments have been done. I mean, and also these deception models don't really exist. It's kind of an awkward space for cognitive science deception, right? Because they kind of like the idea that they see things as they are, right?
Yeah.
And so it kind of rocks the boat a little bit.
So here's my question, because I've been thinking about this whole issue of realism and fantasy, basically, deception being one source of mismatch with reality. And during the waking period of the conscious brain, we have to be reality focused to a considerable extent, although there are all kinds of mistakes, of course, that we make. And one of the reasons why we make a mistake is because we grow up as babies in jungles, right? And jungles are full of camouflaged animals and threats and, mosquitoes that cause pain, snakes that are hidden underneath, people who mean us harm, all those kinds of things. So the world inherently, the natural world, is hyper complex, and we need to make enough sense out of it to be able to survive, or run to mommy or something like that, because our guardians are so important in the first 10 years, of course, and also by virtue of the fact that we're evolved creatures. By virtue of that fact, we also have reproductive aspects that are inherently, they're not separable from survival. They are part of the same package. And that is, one, to me, plausible hypothesis is that our overgrown brains, because we have more brains than we strictly need in order to survive and reproduce. So we have our overgrown brains, and that might be a reproductive signal of some kind, at least in some contexts. Sometimes it's better to have a smaller head so you don't get hit, by the rock
Less
being
energy
thrown.
needs and
And sometimes, for some strange reason, the trade-offs work the other way, and it's not at all obvious why human beings have heads on top of their bodies, where anybody, can shoot an arrow at our heads and we're dead. So all these trade-offs are interesting and very important. All I'm trying to say really is that reproductive advantage is not really that separate from survival advantage when you look at it.
The one cautionary tale that I'd add, but you can probably define this. When I was talking to your dad, he'd often bring up, if we tell an evolutionary biology story, there is a tendency towards telling just so stories.
Right.
Because part of accepting the feed forward and feedback is to accept, just like in the discovery of the structure of antibodies, was accepting this other kind of specificity that wasn't so linear and determinist. So when we start telling linear determinist stories, then I go back to, now we're doing the feed forward or the feedback stories without the context of the other. So then I always hesitate to tell, oh, we're like this because of that, and actually 10,000 years ago we were scared of that, so we did that. And those kinds of stories to me are a bit, how do we? It's certainly not scientific. It's just ourselves telling ourselves stories that, in the context that we're in, make us feel better, but they're not necessarily rooted in any kind of scientifically observed empiricism.
Right, but then in the process of bumping into brick walls, just about every time you walk into the laboratory, or every time you read a journal for that matter, and here's another bump, and there's another bump, and so on. And I think we become somewhat wiser in that process, so that I think we begin to have some insights, I hope, into what I would like to call reality. And I think reality is definable as that which we don't expect, that which challenges us, and so we have to change in order to adapt, or maybe we'll just, kill the brick wall that's bothering us today. But that's a rather extreme version of that. It does happen all the time, as we know, of course, in human history, right?
But I think it is an aspect that sort of links antibodies and antigens and neurology, in that the DNA hasn't changed very much in 10,000 years and stuff, but the demands of, has. So, I would think of reading is only 5,000 years old, 5,200 years old. So most of humans have never read a single word. The brain isn't built for reading.
It's actually less than 5,000 because our direct ancestors may not have been able to read, going back a few generations.
Even few generations, exactly. Right. So that's where I think immunology and neurology have this sort of great adaptability, flexibility to, just as you said, sort of to react to a vast array of possibilities, but with the 10,000 years of blink of an eye in evolutionary terms, like DNA and those epigenetic changes and stuff. But by and large, it's still the Stone Age brain in the computer age world sort of thing. But we pull it off. I mean, we spend enormous amounts of our waking hours interacting with words and symbols and stuff, and our joys and sorrows, happiness. It's not hunting and gathering berries. It's shifted, in terms of the demands, but we've kind of pulled it off, as a species. We use our brains for completely different moment-to-moment things than we did 10,000 years ago. And so that part is super changed. And then some things you wonder what hasn't changed in terms of our basic sense of happiness, fulfillment, relationships. I think maybe hasn't changed so much in 10,000 years in terms of what we, the essence of what makes us human and what we strive for to be, liked and safe and loved and having resources. It just found me a fascinating mixture of sort of adaptability and stable biology.
Yeah. So,
David, you've been thinking.
Well, I've been thinking a lot. but I think perhaps a really important and a particularly relevant question to ask at this point is, in a world of selectional milieus in which a repertoire meets some event, right? And that event puts pressure upon or does something that essentially weeds out or selects from that repertoire. In that kind of a world, what constitutes a match? And that's a question that applies across the board. It applies across the board in immunology, right? And the definition of match, as we know from my relatives' work, changed the definition of a match in terms of what people were willing to abide in the nascent science of immunology in the late 50s and early 60s. Yeah. Back in the not so good old days, a match was literally a precise lock and key fit.
Right.
And that proved to be not only wrong, but actually kind of limiting in a weird way, because the new definition of match is, whatever worked at a given point in time, and it didn't have to be perfect as long as the antigen bit the dust. Okay? And so what that means is that opens up a new world of possibilities, because now an antibody doesn't necessarily only match one thing or only fit one thing. It's not exactly a skeleton key or whatever. It's not a master key, but it can fit a number of different things. So there's this degeneracy of possibilities, or degenerate number of possibilities, different ways forward. And that actually is kind of a force multiplier in terms of the repertoire of these kinds of systems, the selectional systems. It's dramatically more powerful than a perfect match, because you think, oh, wow, in a world in which antibodies or whatever it is we're trying to match with aspects of that world have to be perfect and nothing else will suffice. Wow, you'll come to a moment in time when it's like, oh, it didn't fit.
And yet they can't be too promiscuous.
They can't be,
and that doesn't work either.
That doesn't work either. But that is,
and it's true in both directions.
It's true in both directions, right? And it's not just a metaphor; it's actually quite powerful. And this is something that really doesn't keep me up at night, I must admit, but it does make for some interesting thoughts that I have in the morning when I wake up and I'm sufficiently with it and aware, conscious, right? I was trying to avoid that, but that I think about that and how powerful that notion is across not just the various levels and realms of biology, levels of biological organization, from gene transcription all the way on up through protein translation, through the immune system, up to the brain, and into these vast ecosystems like rainforests and island biogeographies, and all this. It goes beyond that. I mean, if you want to get into the world, the social domain, the world that we construct as humans, let's just take that as an example. Well, maybe there's a place for this kind of thinking there. And that's not an original idea in the least, in a sense. I think people who use the term meme, right? And Dan Dennett throws this around a lot. He actually talks about the evolution of memes, and he talks about sort of this idea that it's emulating a Darwinian progression. It's sort of a Darwinian system. So that's not new. That idea isn't new. But I think what is new, and what I would suggest is new, and maybe is a good place to kind of end, the dialogue here, is the notion that may represent a new kind of a science, that the science, a science in which you look at how the world is organized, not just the world of biology, but the greater world outside of the extra biological as well. And you come up, obviously these systems in their details are going to be different, but the themes and the overall, what is actually sort of going on still involves this really sort of weird mesh and this weird redefining of the term fit or match.
Yes, and I'm going to try to summarize this in one sentence, if I'm lucky. And that sentence would be, consciousness and biology are not just a matter of a lock and a key. And I think that might even get us all to sing from the same hymn book here. But if it doesn't fit, I'm sure to hear about it. So that's good. Thank you. This is On Consciousness, a series. I'm Bernard Bars. My guests are Mark Mitton, Giedd, and David Edelman. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great deal of fun.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Cheers.
To show our appreciation, we are offering our listeners a 50% discount for any edition of Bernie's book on consciousness, science, and subjectivity, updated works on global workspace theory. Just go to shop.thenautiluspress.com, spelled shop.thenautiluspress.com, and be sure to enter the word books, BOOKS, in the coupon code box during checkout for that extra 50% savings. Of course, Bernie's books are available everywhere books are sold, although your 50% discount is only available in the Nautilus shop. If you'd like to discover more about the conscious brain and learn more about global workspace functions, please visit Bernie's new website at bernardbars.com. And I'm going to spell that also, BERNARDBAARS.com. And thank you for listening.